By far, the #1 most common comment on my Transalp videos has been about where the exhaust is routed and the design of the sump underneath the engine. And I have to agree, it is a major concern. I mean, look at this exhaust, how it's routed directly under the engine. It's the lowest point except for this weirdly exposed oil sump, and the drain plug and the oil filter are super exposed. It's very dangerous. I can't believe that Honda would design a bike like this. Oh, wait a minute. That's my Tenere 700, not my Transalp. Okay, so admittedly I'm trolling a little, but I'm doing it to make a point. And the point is, the design of the Transalp is not unusual in the ADV motorcycle community. The only reason we're talking about it is because Honda delivered that motorcycle without a skid plate. If it came with a stock skid plate like the Tenere here does, then you would never have noticed those issues. You never would have thought about them, even though stock skid plates are kind of not amazing. The one on the Tenere here is about as protective as a soda can. Maybe a little thicker. I'm being facetious in order to make a point, but it's not great. My guess as to what happened is that Honda was very much trying to meet that $10,000 price point, that $99.99, and that is why a few seemingly obvious additions were cut in order to cut cost at the last minute or whatever to deliver the bike for that price point. Stock skid plate is one of those things. Cruise control is another that would have been easy but cost money. But the thing with the skid plate, at least on the Transalp, you have to have crash bars to mount it to. The Tenere here has this frame rail running along the bottom of the bike, so that's another advantage of the Tenere, which is why it's kind of a trollish, facetious comparison, just because there's something to mount crash protection to here, but that barely matters because the engine still sticks down lower than that, and so does the exhaust and the oil filter. It's all very unprotected without that stock skid plate. It's the same thing, except there's some frame rails for support down here at the bottom, and the Transalp doesn't have that. So my guess is Honda cut that, or at least didn't add it in order to save money, knowing that anyone that was planning on taking this bike off-road would add a skid plate and probably would have swapped out the stock skid plate anyway. We all tend to do that. That's my guess about the situation, and I don't know. I don't talk to Honda's engineers, and I'm still getting a feel for this bike and starting to come around to some of the things that the design decisions and maybe some of the reasoning for them. And a lot of things about this bike make more sense than we thought, or at least that I thought, and I know some of you, based on your comments, thought when we first looked at it. I think it's more capable than we're giving it credit for, and we're focusing in on very obvious visual things that seem like make it a bike that's not great. And I'm just wanting to point out that it's not that different from a lot of other bikes. No one says the Tenere can't go off-road. I've never heard anyone say that. And the design of the engine and the way it's protected or not protected is pretty similar. So I'm going to put the Transalp up on the lift, and let's just take a closer look at that undercarriage, though. So this is the Transalp for real this time. This is the undercarriage, so we can take a look at it. It is, you know, exposed. It looks exposed. Although I feel like the oil filter is actually a little bit better protected because it's at least higher up and the exhaust is shielding it a little. And yes, punching a hole in your exhaust would be bad, but not as bad as putting a hole in the case or breaking the oil filter and losing all of your oil. You can ride with a noisy engine. You can't ride without oil in it. I thought it might be fun to measure the actual ground clearance. So I have this bike up on the lift. I've got the straps as loose as they'll go while still holding it down, so there may be a little bit of downward tension, but there's also no rider sitting on it, so, you know, we would have sag in a normal situation. So this is purely illustrative. It's not scientific, but what is the actual ground clearance to the lowest point? Well, first of all, to the oil sump, you've got 8.5 inches exactly, which is about what Honda says. But that's not the lowest point. To the bottom of the exhaust, it's more like 8 inches. Yeah, it's right at 8 inches, a little bit higher. So 8 inches of clearance is not a ton for an off-road bike, but it's not none. It's way more than like the 500X has. And yes, when I get the skid plate on here, I'm probably going to lose another ½ inch. It's a respectable amount of ground clearance for an adventure bike. How do I know? I did some research. I know. Crazy, right? And yes, part of the problem is how exposed everything there is. If it was 8.5 inches with a skid plate, that's different than 8.5 inches to the oil sump. Not arguing that. Like, I do think this bike needs a skid plate no matter what. Don't hear me saying that it doesn't need one if you're gonna take it off-road. It definitely does. But in terms of pure clearance and how in danger those things are on a day-to-day basis, let's talk about a few other bikes that you might wanna worry about as well. Maybe I'll just put my chart up on the screen for you. As you can see, the Transalp is pretty middle of the road. Here are some motorcycles with less ground clearance than the Transalp here. 500X obviously has 7.1 inches of ground clearance. Nobody thinks of that as a super hardcore off-road bike. But the F750 GS, 7.2 inches. This has a full extra inch. R1250 GS, 7.3 inches. The KTM 390 Adventure, 7.9 inches of ground clearance. And the KLR 650 has 8.3 inches of ground clearance, so just about the same. And I've never heard anyone say, boy, that KLR doesn't have enough ground clearance. I mean, for moderate off-roading, again, we're not talking about Poltara's stuff here. We're talking about the type of riding that the people this bike was designed for will do, and I think it's more than enough for that in most cases. Other bikes with similar ground clearance, the Himalayan at 8.6 inches, the G310 GS at 8.7, the V-Strom 800 DE, which some of you will not stop talking about. I just haven't ridden one, okay? I have no bad feelings about that bike. I just haven't ridden one. It has 8.7 inches of ground clearance, so it's essentially the same. They're the same. And then we get up into the bigger bikes. The 890 has 9.2 inches. The Tenere has a full extra inch of ground clearance compared to the Transalp. And then if you're curious, the Touareg is 9.5, Africa Twin 9.8, and the 890 Adventure R, probably the most capable adventure bike there is, or at least one of, if not the most. Yeah, it has over 10 inches, 10.5 inches almost of ground clearance. But with a skid plate, in terms of the types of riding that most people that are going to buy this bike do, the average adventure rider, and even then some, 8.5 inches is enough clearance to do the Washington BDR, to do Babyhead Hill. Anything someone's done on a 1250 GS will be easier on this bike. It has more ground clearance. It's lighter and easier to handle, and people take those things all over the damn place. So this is just me going on record saying I don't think the clearance issues are as big a deal as people think they are, so long as you get a skid plate. And I think Honda knew that you were going to do that anyway, and so they saved you the step of removing the old one. I am not unconfident in what this bike can do, and I'd like to go on record saying that I think I was wrong about a lot of things about this bike, but that's what happens when you make guesses and speculate based on spec sheets and pictures. It's why I bought the bike, because I wanted to know if I was wrong. It's not like I was like, this is gonna be the greatest bike ever, I changed my mind and bought it. I bought it thinking I would test it, make some content, not like it, and sell it, but it's just really growing on me. I mean, we're not at 1,000 miles yet. Keep an eye out for that review. And if you haven't yet, check out the whole playlist of other Transalp content that I've made, including the first on-off-road test, the day that we bought the bike, and the mods videos are coming soon. That stuff's going to start arriving today, I think, so I'm excited to get those put on. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss those future videos. But for now, and as always, I just want to say thank you very much for watching, and please do not forget to be excellent to each other. Thank you.
Excellent!
Dork, did you take your whole skid plate off just to make a trolley intro for this video? Yes. Yes, I did. Now I have to put it back on.